Presented in terms of usury, and I think if we don't deal with the usury, then none of the other things are very easily accomplished, to be quite honest. There's such a stranglehold on the circulation of money, which is what allows us to exchange energy and goods, that, and it's expanded and contracted, that keeps the nation and the world really off balance, and when somebody's off balance, it's very difficult to attack the people who are the usurers. So the question is how one does that. So we either create our own monetary system, as in with the Let's scheme that Mary knows all about. So we create our own currency, and in terms of your arts and income, basic income, universal income, that could possibly be done if we can set up our own economy using our own currency. But you'd come under attack because they always attack you. You know, they got rid of Kennedy, who was going to issue their own currency from their treasury.
Not
They got rid of Abraham Lincoln. So anyone who gets in their way, they're absolutely ruthless. But that's what we have to do, or you get elected. And you make the change so that the treasury issues its own money and usury is made a criminal offence. That's all I have to say, really.
Could you do that, in your opinion, in the nation state? You can
Yes.
down the government.
Yeah, you could do it as a nation state. You've done it before.
What I was thinking is that one could approach it by degrees. So when I first thought about this, they call it UBI, Universal Basic Income. You can make a clear argument for starting with the abuses, which is people being sanctioned by petty bureaucrats and getting nothing. And starting right from the bottom and saying everybody can get an amount that's equivalent to what you get on benefits. And I know it doesn't pay for it. It doesn't pay for everything, because people who get benefits, if they're in a council flat, they also get this housing benefits as well, and it's all terribly complicated. But the point is that when you're assessing people and judging whether they're disabled enough or put in enough job applications or whatever all the horrible criteria are, that takes resources. So you can argue that if you just jolly well give it to them, and everybody who carries on, everybody gets it, whatever, and then anybody who's earning money, that's where their tax starts. So it's bureaucratically straightforward. You just join up all these various systems, like from child benefit, through to pensions. You sort of, everybody's on record, and you just get it, no questions asked. And then when you earn money, the tax goes on top, so that's fair. So, but that's only the very, very basic, and on that basis, it's not costing them anything. It would save them paying for all that bureaucracy, and I don't think that either party could really argue with that.
Would you like the figures from the Global Net talk in Parliament? I've got the numbers.
Yeah, that would be good.
So the net cost of a universal basic income, according to the Royal Society of Arts speaker, was after you closed all of the credits and pension system and expanded it that way, you'd have an 18 billion gap to cover which isn't very much money at all, he was saying, and they've covered gaps like that with JSA before, so that's not very much gap.
Yeah.
And the other thing was that the UBI cost 3 billion to administrate, whereas it currently costs 8, perhaps more, billion to administrate the system.
Yeah.
So as you're saying, there's a massive saving.
Yeah, and the first point of taxation that I don't think anybody could argue against is those empty properties that overseas millionaires are using for land banking to make it not worth their while by charging tax for that, and that would bring a dollop of money in. Nobody could argue with that.
No, I was wanting to hear those figures again that you gave, because it was said fairly quickly and it needed to sink in.
Yeah. Supporting what she was saying,
yeah.
that after you get rid of the various structures that exist that wouldn't need to anymore, such as pension payments and other credits that are not needed, there would still be a gap of 18 billion. But that gap is very easily overcome through, as Mary was saying, certain taxation, and it's often been done in the blink of an eye. We just saw it done to a full trident, for example, much more than 18. The figure for administrating the system at the moment is 8 billion.
The existing benefit system.
And that would shrink to 3 billion. Was it 3 or 5? Did I say?
3.
I think, 3. And he said that so the cost of bullying people is 5 billion. It costs 5 billion to bully people. That's what he said from the Royal Society of Arts economic think tank on this.
I was listening to a David Graeber presentation today, and he mentioned there's always this problem about basic income being a Trojan horse as well, being used as a Trojan horse I've got it here, a way to destroy social programs.
Yeah.
As well. There's always that worry that I think a lot of people share that the basic income could be a way of just taking away any platform and then reintroducing something that's a lot less money to actually upkeep as well. The other thing I wanted to make is kind of from a point, I don't know if Janis made it today, but I think it's very strange when everybody just keeps going on about the economics of it. And it seems to me that anything as hugely life-changing as a basic income, what that actually means, which is kind of a form of redistribution of wealth, in a funny way, would have to be more holistic. It has to be lots of other things. It can't just be, well, here's the money, or can it? Maybe I'm wrong with that. I don't know, but it confuses me. I would imagine it involves a lot more.
Yeah, but what I was talking about, I don't think that the sort of money that they were talking about is enough for people to live on properly. You see, you've always got this problem, and remember, there still are jobs. All the jobs haven't been abolished. It's what happens over time, and the argument against basic income is, if you give it to them, why should anybody bother to work?
Well, I think that's a very good point. And coming back to the point about this is much more than just the economics of the current paradigm. What is essentially the dynamic of our political economy is that those people in a position of privilege over history, they've captured the value of the commons that belongs to everybody. And that's been reinforced by law and government and all the other sort of levers of power. So what we're talking about, just moving away from the actual numbers, there is a fundamental principle at stake here that a very few people actually have what belongs to all of us. And this idea of what's affordable actually undermines or obscures that fact. And the relevance of usury, which we were going to talk about in this first discussion, is that actually exacerbates that original problem. So if the original sin was that the land and all of the commons have been captured by this system that benefits the few at the top, the icing on the cake, or if you like, the thumbscrew that's applied to humanity, is usury, because it's basically turbocharging the inequality. So I think personally, I think the idea of a basic income, as they piloted in India, is a very good first step. And Janos will tell you a story or tell you a saying about what having a basic income will do for people's ability to think beyond the system or outside the system. But actually, what they found in India, although they only paid, I think it was 200 rupees for adults and 100 rupees for children under the age of 18, they actually found it not only created health benefits, it created economic benefits, because people were given freedom to think and act differently. So I think that the concept of usury and the sort of fundamental principles that we've been talking about tonight, like the right to be lazy, the fact that the commons need to be shared, and that usury is a mechanism of theft, are far more important, in my view, than getting bogged down in the detail of the figures that were bandied around the House of Commons, which is why I asked Francis if we could do something beyond what was discussed.
Yeah, the only problem with that argument is that, you know, to change the system of usury or to change the system of the commons is a huge political upheaval that won't necessarily happen today. Whereas if you take the first step, which is what Mary's saying, and you take a step-by-step approach, you can move towards that. So in that sense, the figures are important because, you know, the basic income is about £700 a month. The problem of whether people will not bother to work, which was raised in the Royal Society of Arts guy who was there. I forgot his name. I chaired it. I should have done my meetings. But he said there were only two people who stopped working longer because of it. One was mothers who stayed home to take care of their children, and the other was young people who went into higher education. It didn't affect the work of ethic of anyone else. And it allowed people in what's called the gig economy, where you jump into a job and then jump into another one and then jump into another one because job security isn't there. It gives them that basic security. So in a sense, a step-by-step approach is what Mary's saying, and it's probably...
Well, I don't think it's either or.
No,
I think we need to do both.
It's important to have the vision, and then it's important to have the practical how-to steps as well.
It doesn't seem like the vision is actually being discussed in any form in most of the discussions that are going on around the basic income. I'm just curious if anybody has heard any other ideas.
I think the expectation that the system is going to agree to this without to actually transform itself is an expectation which is unrealistic. I think some sort of basic income might make sense to the capitalist mentality because the existing system there's no demand in. So by giving people a basic income, they help to perpetuate the status quo. But they're not going to turn around and undertake a fundamental shift. That is going to take a shift in human psyche, and unless we're having these conversations about the fundamental principles at stake, then that ain't going to happen. Because what is going to shift the way the world moves is us and the way we think. The fact that we abandon our deference to authority, the fact that we regard interest as theft, and the fact that we regard the commons as ours and not being denied to us by everybody else. And until when that begins to take hold in the human psyche, then the system will collapse and we can implement whatever we like.
I also think there's maybe, without being too much of a scaremonger, there is a fear that waiting, we might actually be running out of time for that, because something's really weird is going on at the moment. And I heard John McDonald the other day going on about what they would do, how they would bring jobs, and you're thinking, why are people, I mean, we know why people are talking about jobs, but why are we talking about jobs still?
Because they don't get it. They don't get it.
Work is used for controlling people rather than
But
necessary.
I don't think...
And maybe it should be brought in slowly, this basic income.
Yeah.
Like in Ireland, they had the scheme where they would give, because the rest of Ireland, apart from the city, is all empty, and they had all these empty villages dying up. And so they were encouraging unemployed people to move out of the cities, like Dublin, and get a free place in a village somewhere, to repopulate it. So that could happen
Yeah.
at the beginning. Give them certain people, if they went to places that were nothing was happening there, like up north. I suppose we'd always said up north. And then people, when they're unemployed, and they think a lot, and they start doing things, and probably start creating companies, and they don't just sit around watching telly all day, I hope. But that's the fear, I suppose.
It's an interesting point, but the people who have actually captured the commons are lazy, have the right to be lazy. The Duke of Westminster, I know for a fact, does actually work, but most of his family, who enjoy the benefit of the wealth of the Westminster estate, Graeber estate, do bugger all. They are lazy, feckless.
Well, we should get rid of this word work.
Yeah,
And it's
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just living. And we separate work, learning and pleasure, and I think they should all come together.
Yeah, it's all right.
And they're not separate things. So whatever you're doing, you're learning, and it could be working, but you could be enjoying it as well, so it's pleasure.
I spend quite a lot of time in towns where nobody's employed, and it seems to me that there's very little going on in the way of trying to get out of that. Now, I don't know what to do about it, and I keep going back, and I do things which are meant to be an example of how you could cope with your unemployed life. And nobody takes a blind bit of notice of anything. So it may be quite a tough task. But yes, all those northern towns, various towns in Wales, there's a whole mass of them, with virtually, really the whole population is unemployed.
Yeah, but they could create some industries up there.
Of
They
course
could
they
create
could.
green industries. What about, I don't know what they should be doing, building windmills or something or other,
They could
there's
do
solar
all
panels,
sorts.
they could set up factories to do useful things like that and save energy.
So maybe-
Somebody just has to, the government just has to
Take
decide they're going to
capital,
fund
doesn't
it, just
it?
do it.
Well,
Well, we
I
should-
think you're falling into the trap that Eddie referred to. McDonnell, Corbyn and these people are all talking about employment, workers' rights and all the rest of it. The debate, that is 20th century
Yes, it's an
debate.
old paradigm.
We have to move on.
Yeah.
It is not a question of people actually being needed to be given what David Graeber refers to as bullshit jobs or muck jobs, jobs created just to get people busy. People need to actually unlearn all of the damage and brainwashing that they've been subjected to from birth. The idea that unless you are in employed work, you are less than a full human being. And it comes back to this idea of the right to be lazy. And I hear what you say about these towns that are decimated, but the problem is there's no hope, there's no spark of community to actually regenerate. And that has to come from people actually re-understanding, reconnecting as communities, and getting away from this diet of distraction via the television, the bullshit politics that comes across the airwaves through the BBC.
And the drugs.
Well, drugs are an escape from the reality that they've been subjected to.
Well, commons mean all the natural resources which nature provides. It's not the result of human effort, okay? And that includes, for example, space on which you can start a factory or build a house, land. Now, because these commons are absolutely essential to make human effort fruitful, because as the example of the farmer, unless there is rain and sunshine, etc., his work is not going to produce. So because the commons, access to the commons is so vital for creating wealth, you create value for what is called economic value, which shows up in society as a fee for access to the creative forces of nature. Grown estate. I don't know what he does, the main man, but you say the rest of the family.
It turns up to the office, guys.
You see, what they normally claim to do is they manage their estate. But that means that they are collecting the rent from the people who are working the estate. So they are managing something, but they are not actually doing the creative work which the tenants are doing on there. They just manage the flux of unearned rental, which the real creators of wealth. Now that unearned flux of rental income is the reason why the idea of land value taxation would be one of the best candidates for when we discover where to get the money from. In London, a property grows, the value of property on average is increasing by 5% a year at least, and on the average property like 2.5 million, like the house I live in. I don't own it, but that means that the value accrues at the rate of £40,000 every year, just because so many people are wanting to live in Camden because there are relatively good schools and hospital, etc. So the value of natural resources is created by people who need to use them, but at the moment it is pocketed by the vested interests who claim that they actually own it. They claim to own something that was given by nature. They are the gatekeepers, and if you want to farm my piece of land, then I don't know, it's £10,000 an acre a year you have to pay. Now that would be the property of the people, really, and together, in aggregate, it's a substantial amount of money.
Can I just pick Janos up in the context of the figures that David was putting forward? That actually, if you extrapolate the one house that Janos was talking about and imagine the amount of money we could generate, then a meaningful citizens' dividend rather than just a basic income becomes a viable proposition, as well as funding all the public services for nothing. So free transport, free healthcare, all of those things would be possible.
So are you arguing, Janos, that to achieve that we need to take into public ownership all that?
Yes, public ownership, not necessarily state ownership, public ownership.
Common ownership.
Common ownership.
Which was in fact the policy of the Liberal Party in the 19th century in the Henry George movement.
But not the houses on the land, just the land underneath.
The rental value, not even the physical piece of land, it's the economic rent that will be shared out.
Much along the lines of the gentleman here, that one would have to nationalise all farmland owned by corporations and pension funds and maybe redistribute that to what would be independent farmers that could be trained or skilled up into the use of the land. Then you're bringing the income back into the people, but not into the corporations that then have offshore tax havens, etc. That would keep more wealth in the nation.
Well, I'm bearing in mind that when you refer to the pension funds owning all these pieces of land and so forth, pension funds are the savings for retirement of the people.
Yes.
And so it creates all kinds of circular arguments about where does value and possession lie, because the pension fund is people's what they put aside for their old age, and if you take that away, then they no longer have that self-provided provision.
But they
exactly. Which is what we're always
they will need a pension with
and the pension funds pay the tune of the usurers. They're in the pockets of the usurers. They buy or sell as
Sorry, can I just say something? I've got a very strong feeling that pension funds is a big scam.
Yes.
And people are saving up money for their own old age, and it goes into a pension fund, and they're investing it in the stock market in companies that we've got absolutely no control over. And it's like, hang on a second, and we're all supposed to do this? Something isn't right here.
There's a lot of people losing their pension pots.
Yeah.
So I agree with you, but a citizens' dividend eradicates the problem.
Yeah.
But going back to Roger's point, when you start talking about confiscation, it frightens the pants off people. You don't need to confiscate anything. You don't need to nationalise anything. As Janos says, all you need to do is take the economic rent that they're not entitled to. And over time, you know, if you imagine these huge landed estates, if they were actually paying a full economic rent, over time, they would end up having to sell off some of their land in order to be able to service, if they wanted to hang on to their Rembrandts or whatever baubles they've accumulated, they would have to start selling stuff because they would no longer be able to capture the wealth that was ours. They would have, and there would be a form of distribution, redistribution, but without confiscation, without any sort of penal approach to this. Because as soon as you start talking about, well, we need to nationalise the land and confiscate land, then you're going to put up barriers. We don't need to do that. We just need to take what's rightfully everybody's and share it.
I'd like to add to that.
Sell it to. Sorry.
No.
How
Who do they sell it to?
Well, you
People
create
who want to move
a.
out of the cities.
No, you create
If
a.
you're doing that, they probably don't buy it.
We could create our own monetary authority which creates its own money and could buy excess land for the public good, and over time we could provide some social housing and public land.
In connection to that, what I was going to say was that there is, talking about the existing pot of land which is rented out, there is also another aspect of the commons which is isn't owned yet, which is the creation of energy producing technologies that don't exist yet. And so one of the things that has tied wealth to locations has been oil and gas being in specific locations. With new technology, polonium, nuclear, through to completely green energy, you have energy that can be produced almost anywhere. Not everywhere, in that on the equator you have a temperature problem that reduces the efficiency, but in most places in the globe, especially if you collaborate between states, you have the ability to generate energy which is the basis of modern wealth all over the world. And that energy is not yet owned. That energy is something that, without upsetting anyone over their Rembrandts and so on, could be pooled in a national trust of energy and can lead to wealth creation that can be distributed.
That's why it's suppressed. I mean, the technology is there already.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of places in the globe where it's not suppressed, and it is those nation states have more money to spend on their citizens per capita. Not just because there's fewer people in those countries, but because they.
Do you have an example?
Well, I was thinking, I mean, Norway, for example, a lot of its free education and public services coming from fossil fuels, but then we're looking ahead, and all the way across the Baltic to Finland, in those states, and in the Netherlands as well. It's slightly more complicated in the Netherlands, but in that area you get that sort of thing going on.
And the Germans report an electricity surplus at the moment.
Yes. Well, France and Germany create our electricity.
Solar electricity.
There's a place in Germany where they import water from Switzerland, I think. They generate electricity with it and sell the electricity to Switzerland. And they make a profit. But
the Switzerland get it from America.
Yeah. Well, in the investments in the banking system.
Yeah, they have this village. The people realize, well, these tanks with water going all the time, with millions of gallons of it, and they find out it was from the waterfalls. I don't know this, but it's called Life Bottle, the film, and it's anyway. So these people began to complain. So they move away to the next village. But in the next village, the Switzerland were more clever. They pay a lot of tax, help with the education, do playground for children, and they are trying to get the water from that place. And these people came and complained. Anyway, the story is that now Switzerland is suing the first village for rumors that
Rumours.
But the rumor that
So,
they
You
spread.
said there was a
Spreading
film,
rumors.
Yes, it's called Bottle Life.
Bottle Life,
Bottle Life, yeah, which is the water, you know.
and
It's very interesting. Yeah, just
I wanted to ask a bit about the banking idea, because again, although we all know that usury is wicked, it's quite a heavy-duty thing to abolish usury, because that's how they, the debt-based system of creating money is how it's done. And Ellen Brown's argument is that you nationalise it. So you say, okay, that's how you create money, but instead of the banks doing it, and paying all their gazillions for their bonuses and all that, the government takes over the banks. And she studied what they've done in North Dakota. They've done this in North Dakota. And I was archiving all these old papers from the CCMJ website. And 2 years ago, I came across a paper that talked about what they were doing in Hampshire. And this academic...
Richard Werner.
Yes. And it's only just been set up. It's been 2 years. They announced it in 2014, and apparently it's only just been set up. But it's the local authority is sponsoring this bank in Hampshire, which is not paying, because it's doing the lending, it's charging the interest, but the profits are going into local authority infrastructure, and it's just normal salaries. You don't get gazillions in bonuses for working at that bank. It's a normal job, and so again. Even people complained about that, but it's to say, oh well, we're going to abolish usury, it's not going to happen. But if you say, oh well, we can shift, it's like shifting, and of course we have the big 6 banks, and in North Dakota it was smaller banks, and so they were able to nationalise it. But we've got credit unions, they've got loads of credit unions in Ireland, we haven't got so many, but there are institutions that can be brought in. There is some infrastructure, and little experiments can be looked at.
In Hampshire, was it the local authority that set up the bank?
Well, it's Richard at the University of Southampton.
Yeah.
Who's actually setting up these community banks. He's German, and he's modelling it on the Landesbanks of Germany. I mean, I think this whole concept of interest, and obviously within the existing paradigm, what Richard's doing is brilliant because it's removing power from the major banks. But it's still inherently problematical because, one, it imposes costs and distribution of wealth which is unfair. In other words, people who need money end up having to pay people who have more money than they need. So it's a fundamental problem. But more importantly, one of the great problems of trying to discuss these issues is that people don't understand. This political economy has evolved to make it deliberately opaque, to make you believe that we need experts to divine the runes of the markets and interests and futures and trading and all the rest of it. If you had no interest, none of that would exist. And if you think about what our political economy needs to do, it is relatively very simple, but it's been made exceedingly complicated, so most of the people in this room don't understand it. But actually it's very simple. It's very simple because those at the top who control the system are taking what belongs to all of us, and they're using the mechanism of interest to steal even more on top of that. That's pure and simple. All of the rest of it is bullshit to stop you asking questions and to abdicate responsibility to others because they know these things. They're clever, they're economists. They've been brainwashed like the rest of us. And so the problem with interest is it makes the economy complex. And we can do without that, because if we don't have interest, people will understand what's going on.
The story that comes to mind is of the Persian invasion of Babylonia, where they dammed the river creating a massive hole in defences which they could then go through. And this was something obviously the Babylonians had not considered. And my fear is that we're taking on the defences of the banks head on by attempting to modify the way they control usury, and that perhaps it's possible to, through much greater forces like the environmental forces, to sap their strength from the outside and besiege them, in the sense that if you have a community where through action that you've been describing you could isolate a particular community and you could make it so that everyone could afford to live there and had travel for almost for free and didn't have to pay for heat, light and so on, you could almost eradicate their living costs through a strategic use of...
Yeah, or you could have community currency.
You actually take away the power of the banks.
Yeah. You just have another kind of mechanism.
Yeah.
Could I just back to Francis's question about taking the land back as well? It's just an observation I had yesterday, because I went round with the flyer for this event and took photos in various areas that I discussed with Clive, one being the Grosvenor estate. But yesterday Clive had mentioned to go to One Hyde Park, which I believe is the most expensive residential
Was.
So I walked up the sideway. I don't know if anybody's ever been there. It's across from Knightsbridge tube station. But I walked up the sideway, and there was cameras everywhere with signs saying, "You are being filmed, you are being filmed, you are being filmed." So I went round and I was trying to find an emblem to hold this thing up and take the photo. And there was a guy standing there with a curly thing in his ear, and I thought, I'll ask him. I said, "Is it okay if I take a photograph of it?" And he went, "No, you're not allowed to take photographs." I said,
"Why did you ask?"
"You're not real." No, well, I just asked because it was a ridiculous situation. So everybody passing there is being filmed 24 hours a day, but they have this rule that you can't take photographs. He then said, "If you go over there," and there was a line, he said, "You can take a photograph." But I just think, when thinking about the Commons, I mean, ridiculous situations like that in central London that you're passing through every day might be actually good focus points for people to at least to highlight the ridiculous situation of it from that experience.
If you have, I mean, just go back to the Commons a minute. Are you saying, Janos, that all land would not have any rent on it at all, and the only payment that would be made is for the infrastructure that goes on the land, or would there be some sort of notional rent? And if there was, who would make that decision about the rent if there's no market that's working?
I think it's simple. It's the market who will make a decision, because the value of the land is the amount of demand for it. If 10 people want a piece of spot to build a house, it has a certain value. If 100 wants to build, they bid the price up. It's a kind of auction situation, and that's the market.
So we go back to zero and we come back to where we are now.
Well, except
that the rent goes to everyone rather than to the landlord.
So a land tax, is it?
Yeah, yes, but it is not going into the private pocket of the landowner. It goes to the local community via whatever authority is there.
It's our commons.
Correct, it's right. And then distribute it as basic income, or create a new infrastructure, an extra school, so that even more demand comes to that place, and the property becomes more valuable. Either the rent becomes more valuable, but the key is it's not going to be into private pocket.
So if money goes back,
it's not a private income.
So if money goes back to the public purse, then you're creating what used to be called social wage, which is not what you've got in terms of money. It's what you've got in terms of free services.
Yeah. Yes, it could
so
be.
basic income plus social wage, with the mechanism to create that social wage more effectively, is what you would have to do.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
So will there be mortgages?
You will pay the builder who puts up the house if you have a room. Yeah. So you will be renting the room.
Yeah. What I'm trying to get at is
the mortgage is for the physical property. The tax is for their right to occupy that particular space exclusively.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to get at, how do you get any of these things actually into the system?
I think who was it? David was talking about.
Yeah, you create a Garden of Eden somewhere where things.
No, not Garden of Eden.
You just create local
you give people an
initiatives.
alternative that sucks away the monopoly of the bank over their lives. Yeah. Very, very practical stuff.
Yeah. Well, it was very interesting that when community currencies were gaining ground in the 90s, the New Economics Foundation scuppered it all and made it absolutely not fundable and set up time banks. And all the time banks got funded because they don't talk about the economy. They don't talk about money. It's all hours of volunteering and reciprocity and all that feel-good stuff. And you know, completely sort
keeps you busy,
kiboshed, you know, because Lex was up front and talked about the currency, you know, a different way of creating money. And they definitely, you know, don't want that to happen. And, you know, so that's why it's kind of, it looks as though it's not happening, except it is, you know, underground.
But it was very difficult, wasn't it?
What?
That I was a member, wasn't I? There were various problems, and most of the problems were to do with individuals' confidence. So
yeah, because you're in a minority and you've got a system which is not the mainstream, and you're sort of on the back foot all the time, and you're dealing with you're not, you know, the people who are running it aren't being paid to run it, and they don't know how to organise anything, and they've always got personal issues, and you know, it's of course you've got all those problems, because it's you know, it's minority people who are vulnerable who are trying to do it.
I'm talking
There's
about
no resources being put into.
Trading is very important to human existence because of the way we think. And what I found, both in the Our Bank at Peckham and in the Southwark and Brixton and some other lets I was in, I can't remember which, was that in all cases I accumulated a massive amount of spare currency, which I couldn't spend because there was nobody doing things which I wanted.
Well, this is why.
Yeah, we want nets, not lets.
Yeah, but
national.
But if you've got if you've got a joined up
and
system,
you can buy things with it.
You know, that would always have value.
Yeah,
You'd be able to spend it somewhere else later. You'd be able to go on holiday with it. You'd be able to get this with it.
I agree.
But I mean, you've
Peckham
got.
still owe me.
Okay, well, you know, you've got a few dozen people sort of who are malfunctioning, who are trying to put a system together, and paper-based systems at that time. They didn't even use a computer.
No, they didn't. No.
Well, there you
It's
go.
rather good, that was.
Again, I just wanted to introduce this idea of the arts into this for specific reasons, because it was mentioned, why would this be part of the whole thing? And I think there's very good reasons. Again, listening to this David Graeber thing, I got a couple of quotes that I think are quite strong. And it was about people being scared of visionary politics. And what's been happening in this country and possibly across the Western world is a war against the imagination that's been going on for the past 30, 40 years. Also, some of the best experiments are the ones that don't work, which is an interesting thing. And also I thought was really important is the question was, what is socially useful work? And these are all things that I think, as a working artist, have been in play, particularly during the later 50s and 60s, and then disappeared in a weird way, and they've been encompassed, completely overhauled by the market. One of the things that I've noticed about working artists is they haven't moved on at all. Most artists, when you go to art school or wherever else, they are all hitched to the galleries. They've never moved anywhere. They might do the most imaginative work in the world, but it's stayed there. And if you think about what artists do and what they represent, when you think about Mr. Van Gogh cutting his ear off and then everybody 100 years later are buying the thing and saying this is a work of genius, sometimes artists, because they're out there doing odd things, find things. And they find things as a purpose to actually lead the world somewhere. But what's happened is to artists and writers and thinkers, they've been pushed into a world that's a monetary world, that they're just repeating themselves in the same way. Not everybody, this is a generalisation, but there's very few artists pushing the box out at the moment. And I think that's disturbing. Where I've found it really interesting is you wouldn't have a conversation like this in an art school anymore, or between a group of artists. They wouldn't do it. And it's what's fascinating for me, being involved in critical thinking, is that the imagination and the way that you're allowed to take ideas happens in groups like this, which says to me that artists need groups like this as much as groups like this may need artists. And I think there's something within that adds to the whole conversation and actually takes it somewhere else. So this may be an idea of a different paradigm. It brings this sort of obscurity into people's lives directly, not by standing in huge queues along Oxford Street to pay 20 quid to go and have a look at some paintings that you don't understand, but to actually sit in a room and discuss things and see how people's minds change and how horizons are opened up. And I think, just leading into what David and Ping and the Henningham Family Press are doing, and very few artists are doing it at the moment, is opening up this conversation between us all, so we can actually move somewhere with it. And I think it's a very important part. And so that's why I thought it was important to invite David here today to present something on this idea. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, David. I know yours was a bit more nuts and bolts.
Well, I mean, to what you just said, I think that in this country, an art education has very much become a product to be sold. That it's sold to people coming from overseas to study and to subsidise the whole system of art education. I was at the very end of the sort of 1970s style art education. I could see it being dismantled behind me, but I got the best of it and saw what was happening to students younger than me, and that it has become a commodity rather than an actual education of that sort. And I think that a lot of students just don't have the raw material to understand. On the good side, though, there's a lot of discontent. They don't know why they're unhappy with it, but I've taught students in the last couple of years who've been profoundly unhappy with the education they're receiving, but they just don't know what should have been in its place. Anyway.
Picking up a point that you were saying, that it's important for artists to be involved in groups like this, I thoroughly agree. I mean, I've never been very associated with art or artists, but every last Tuesday of the month in the evening we have the Extremist Club in Soho, which was a response to lack of freedom of speech. And the Extremist Club was brought together from theatre people and nationalist politics. And the idea is that all of us are threatened by lack of freedom of speech, which comes about with the dismantling of the ethos of art education and everything else, that it's all become a product. And this is happening in every aspect of life, and I'm just saying that in other areas there seems to be an automatic response that art is mixing in now with other groups. And I sort of support I go once a month to the Extremist Club. Not that I enjoy all of the poetry or anything like that, I just think the idea hits a chord with me that it's a good idea, although I'm not involved much in that side. I'm more on the political side, but it's a good idea that the mix happens. I think it's very healthy that the mix happens. And just lastly, astrologically, the good news is that planetary alignments at the moment are exactly the same as it was at the French and American Revolution. So change is going to happen very fast. So we better be prepared. And we need the artists, because the artists express what's going on, I think.
Well, I just wanted to add one other thing I forgot to say about this, and it is to do with the security that was mentioned earlier on, and what people want, and questions like, will we still have mortgages? I know that's not what you were concerned about as a question. And it's this thing that always, I mean, we've seen it in the political scope over the last 2 weeks, that now there's someone in place and now we can get back to sitting in our same seats and saying the same thing, and now we know where we are. But the fact is that that everything is not good at the moment, and these things are even more of a thin veneer. And this idea that what's happening around here could actually become what your job is, to define what your role is in the world, is far more interesting than going to work for a bullshit job. I don't mean the proper, but a bullshit job, and having no time to think about that. And I think the basic income opens that whole thing up and just broadens the whole thing. And is it?
In a sense, we've got a great opportunity to sort of fulfil that now, don't we? Because if the growth of artificial intelligence and robotics means that jobs are going to be short supply, particularly unskilled jobs, because they're going to be taken over by robots and artificial intelligence, then people are going to have spare time. If they have spare time, they're either going to be, if they have no income, they're either going to be in revolt all the time, and you're going to have a violent society, or you're going to create a society where you've got a basic income, and you've got other means that you talk about, you build on, like the net system, alternative currencies, sharing economy, all those things, which then allows people to do other things like art, like thinking, like reflecting, which we at the moment don't value, but which could be valued again. So in one sense, the situation is pretty pessimistic at the moment, but the opportunities in the future are quite optimistic if we can grab those opportunities in a very positive way.
I think if you think about what the state does, or what the system does, it atomizes families, it atomizes communities, and it atomizes education. So as human beings, this current economy seems to regard art as entertainment rather than being integral to life. And I think what Eddie was talking about, these sorts of conversations, if I think about the experience of critical thinking, which has been going 4.5 years now, it is the huge richness and diversity of participation. People who've been involved online, people who've come along to the meetings, people we've met, people we've interacted with. It's such a diverse range of people. And yet, if you go to a university to study politics or economics, you are confined to this. This is what the curriculum is. These are the questions that are legitimate. These are the questions that you cannot ask. And what art is doing in this context is actually challenging us with questions that wouldn't normally be asked. And there is no space to do that within the current political economy. And that's why I think David hit the nail on the head, that we need to create something outside the system that makes it irrelevant. Because the human experience encompasses all these things, including our artistic imaginations. And society doesn't accept that. So we've got to create space for it to happen.
Withdraw consent, isn't it?
Yeah, you withdraw consent to be treated in this way.
This was talked about in the 70s. They were saying, because of the technology advances, then we need to educate people for leisure.
Yeah.
And there would be no work in the future. This should be happening now. But we're still
Everybody's
talking about
working
the
on
future.
Facebook.
And in 2001 there was a programme called Test the Nation. It was BBC. It was an IQ test, kind of a quiz show, and it covered the whole of Britain. People could do it on the internet or over the phone or live, while it was on. But they divided the country into groups of workers and plumbers and lawyers and whatever. But when they got the result, they was very shocked. And who won? The group that won. Does anyone know?
The artist.
No, it's the unemployed.
Excellent.
There was
Speaks volumes, doesn't it?
something that we researched in our work for this quite extensively was Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition. And one of the interesting things she describes with her description of the Greco-Roman society was that an idiot was someone who accumulated wealth they didn't need. And they couldn't understand people who would continue to work after they had enough wealth to sustain their public life. The idea was that wealth was life, the polis was life after wealth. You had a certain amount to live on from your estate. I mean, obviously this was an unequal system because they were slaves, but now we have energy slaves. The slaves are not conscious people, potentially, and so whereas the system much later on, the one that we come from, the bourgeoisie had this idea of creating capital which would outlast their lifetime. So instead of having a life after earning wealth, they wanted their wealth to give them life after death. It was a totally different back-to-front way of thinking about it. And as Eddie was saying, one of the things that artists have been doing, and the unemployed, is experiencing life after wealth, when there is actually, you can scrape by on surprisingly little. And, if we were to then introduce a generous citizens dividend, you'd see a massive explosion in ingenuity and context. This has been tested people have voluntarily tested this by refusing to work and doing stuff at home.
I only had one little tangent to what David was saying. In ancient China, you paid your doctor when you were well. This is the same logic. And when you were ill, you stopped paying him.
There was something on the news about if you haven't been to the doctor for 5 years, they might take you off the list.
Can I say, because we're getting close to 9 o'clock, you usually finish then, do you? Yeah. I was just going to say, this is the first time we've done anything with critical thinking following one of our meetings, and I just think it's a really, really useful exercise because it makes you go beyond the basic idea, in this case it was basic income, and think of other repercussions and consequences, both unintended and intended. So I think it's been a really useful exercise to do, and I hope we do it again. I suppose when you get in a circle, you go off in all sorts of tangents, you think, what the hell has this got to do, what the agenda was to begin with, but that's part of the sort of magic of it, is, in a way, as long as you've got someone who can bring it back to where you started, which I think is probably quite important, but I think it's been really worthwhile. So thanks for doing it.
Well, it's a pleasure. Essentially, this is what we do. We meet every week, we talk. Generally, we have an agenda, but I often come to the meetings thinking, right, I've got the agenda, and I go away thinking, well, we didn't do what I thought we were going to do. But actually, by iterative conversation, we're actually looking at the world in a holistic way. And if you contrast that with the way people address any particular subject, they tend to address them in isolation, in abstraction. And when you do that, you neglect the ramifications and the consequences of the whole picture. What this evening is not about is recruiting people to the critical thinking group. But what it is about is to encourage people to indulge in critical thinking, wherever they may be. And whatever your particular shtick is, in terms of whatever you think is most important in the world, whatever affects you most, you need to put it into context of the sort of things that we've been discussing. Because once you start to do that, you begin to understand the dynamic of why these things are happening, because everything is connected. Nothing happens by accident. And I'm not going to go into an advertisement for critical thinking, but if you read the homepage of the Critical Thinking website, freecriticalthinking.org, that can start you on a journey. And you don't have to continue that journey on critical thinking. You can go anywhere for this journey. So my exhortation to anyone who has anything to do with critical thinking, you don't have to come and join us on a weekly basis. You don't even have to look at us ever again. But go away and explore the sort of things that we've been discussing tonight, and discuss them with your family, with people, because that's the way we're going to change the world, through people talking to each other, not through mediated hierarchies like government or media or whatever else.
Having said that, you'd be quite happy if people wanted to join the group, and they could contact you, and critical thinking people, if they want to get involved with the Global Net 21, we would welcome them as well. Okay.
Thank you.